And he had gone to college in University of Kentucky. He was from Illinois. In fact, he was from the same town as William Jennings Bryan, Salem, Illinois. And William Jennings Bryan had delivered his commencement address in high school. But he went to school in Kentucky, and his father had been a labor organizer, an immigrant labor organizer, a radical socialist, an avowed atheist. And in Kentucky, he had been impressed when the president of the University of Kentucky had stood up to William Jennings Bryan and fought the passage of an anti-evolution law in Kentucky and won by one vote in the state legislature. And so when the offer was made, will you stand for a test case? And that everybody knew he hadn't actually violated the law, but you don't need to actually have been taught to bring sort of a test case. They were originally envisioning what's known as a declaratory judgment action. But he said yes, and so they nominally arrested him. He never went to jail. Of course, the statute didn't call for a criminal penalty. It was a $100 fine if you were convicted. And he went back and played tennis. They called the ACLU. Well, she worked for Roger Baldwin, who was the founder of the ACLU, and it was her job to clip newspapers.
Where was she located?
She was located in New York. The ACLU hadn't reached much beyond New York. It was only about 7 years old at the time.
And what was it then?
And it was an organization that had been founded during the World War I to defend people opposed to the war. World War I was an incredibly controversial war. There were many people opposed to it, including William Jennings Bryan, who had, of course, resigned as Secretary of State in protest over the war. And they defended pacifists who opposed to the war, and also speakers who wanted to speak out against the war, and then got into opposing the Red Scare. That's how they got started, and then they moved on to defending labor unions and the right to laborers to organize, and defending radical groups such as communist or socialist or anarchist. Their creed had become, by 1925, free speech.
And they used to be called the National Civil Liberties Bureau?
They were founded that way, and that's when they focused on defending anti-war activists. And when they decided to broaden out and defend free speech more generally, then they took the name the American Civil Liberties Union. And by 1925, their commitment was a defense of the First Amendment, especially the free speech, right to assemble. And that brought them head-on into opposition to something like an anti-evolution law, which was limiting academic freedom and free speech by teachers.
So this secretary is in New York City, the ACLU headquarters. The clippings come through, and she spots them.
Well, she actually did the clipping herself. The newspapers come in. She used to tell stories how her hands were always just black every night because she'd have to cut. And remember the old newsprint? At least I remember it, and I think it was even worse in the 20s. And she'd have to cut out all these clippings. And so she ran across the notice that Tennessee had passed the anti-evolution law and passed it on to Roger Baldwin, who was the great founder of the ACLU. And immediately they knew they had another case.
By the way, had Baldwin been in jail already?
Oh, yes. Baldwin was put in jail during World War I for avoiding the Selective Service and for counseling others to avoid the Selective Service Act.
So he's back running the ACLU now.
Correct.
She sees this clipping. 1925.
Yep.
What happens?
He calls together the ACLU board and draws in their consultants. And let's see, who was active then? Felix Frankfurter was very active, the great Harvard Law School professor. And so he was consulted and
went on to be a Supreme Court justice.
Went on to be a famous Supreme Court justice. A variety of different attorneys in New York. Sam Rosenthal, who was very active with the ACLU, Arthur Garfield Hayes, who was the attorney who ends up coming down to the Scopes trial. He's
got to stop you there because you say in the book how he got that name.
It's a wonderful story because here he becomes a leading defender of civil rights, a radical, a staunch Democrat, a very committed liberal Democrat, and his father was a very conservative Republican from upstate New York, and he already had the last name Hayes, so he picks the other names, basically names him for a string of Republican presidents. The advantage of knowing his name is then you can remember that medley of Republican presidents that come between Grant and McKinley.
Arthur Garfield Hayes.
Arthur Garfield Hayes. They're only in the wrong order. He should have arranged the other two names so it fit the direction, but he was named for those Republican presidents. It's not that he had a particularly noble pedigree himself. He wasn't related to any of these people. Hayes is actually spelled different than President Hayes' name, but his father, who was a staunch Republican, liked the idea of stringing together those names.
And he was on the ACLU Executive Committee?
Yes, he was very active with the ACLU. He was a Park Avenue lawyer. He had a thriving practice in defending of corporations. He had wealthy individuals, made a lot of money doing that, but he grew terribly bored doing that. And what he wanted to do was be on the cutting edge of social change and social activism, and that's why he got involved with the ACLU. And he had wonderful exploits. He liked to do the adventure himself. He wasn't a courtroom lawyer. He was a courtroom lawyer, but where he liked to be was on the cutting edge. So when H.L. Mencken protested a censorship law in Boston by selling his books, a banned book in Boston Commons, the great editor H.L. Mencken, Arthur Garfield Hayes went with him, also peddling banned books in Boston. He went out to the coal mines to be right with the coal mines when they were in some bitter coal strikes. It was a great story. He's warned, you can't go out, this was some town in Pennsylvania, you can't go out there. They'll tar and feather you and they'll castrate you. And his eyes got big and says, well, that'll be interesting, and off he went. When they were trying to bust a strike in Jersey City, he didn't wait and be a lawyer. He went down there and climbed on top of a car and gave a speech to speak down the mayor. And then, he was a Jew, of course, when the trial comes for the people accused of burning down the Russianstalt building by the Nazis, he goes to Nazi Germany and tries to defend those people against the Nazis. So he was a man of action, and he loved adventure, and he didn't want to be bored. And he was there on the cutting edge, and when you read his autobiography and various letters he wrote, the place he loved most was when he was at Dayton with Clarence Darrow.
By the way, you mentioned H.L. Mencken, and you quote him a lot in the book. What were his politics back in 1925?
Oh, he was libertarian then, too. He was...
but he wasn't a liberal.
No.
Or a Democrat.
No, I imagine he'd support a Democrat if he thought the Republicans... He certainly wasn't a committed... by any means, he wasn't a committed Democrat. He wasn't a supporter of any party. He'd argued against Wilson. He'd argued against Teddy Roosevelt. He would later argue against the New Deal. He was suspicious of government. He was what he could do was he could put words together. He could give life to thoughts. But he was very suspicious of government. He was more a libertarian.
Is there any way to compare? You were talking about Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, John T. Scopes and H.L. Mencken, if we were to name people today in our world that had that kind of visibility or that kind of importance, lawyers, any way to do that, cases?
Good question. I would say that the puzzling thing is both Darrow and Bryan had two hats. They were famous for two reasons. I suppose if you took, as a defense lawyer, Clarence Darrow would hold the role of an F. Lee Bailey, maybe. But he was also America's leading critic of revealed religion. And so in that sense, he would also hold, as I mentioned earlier, maybe Carl Sagan's role, but he'd combine them.
He wrote a book about being an agnostic?
Oh, he wrote many. Right. He wrote a book, but he would go around on the Chautauqua circuit at that time, which was before television, and people would go around and lecture, and he'd go around giving talks. He was very popular, Chautauqua circuit speaker, about the dangers of religious fundamentalism, the dangers of religious zealotry, the foolishness of basically the aspects of the Bible and the Bible in generally, and he would call Christianity a slave religion by sense he meant it enslaved its followers, not that it would lead to war and destruction, conflict, exploitation. That Christianity justified those. So in that sense, he was well, one of his biographers, Clarence Tierney, I think it was Clarence Tierney, said he was the village atheist on the national scale.
What about William Jennings Bryan now?